Welcome to Apple Core, a podcast about the history of Apple. In each episode, we travel back in time to explore the story behind a different Apple product and consider what it tells us about where the company may be heading next. I'm Graham Bauer, a designer, writer, app developer, and long-time Apple user.
I'm Charlie Sorrell, writer and sometime podcaster.
And today we're talking about the history of Apple's open source projects, including WebKit, Darwin, LLVM, and Swift. And to help us dive into this topic, we have a special guest, Martin Algerston. His open source projects include Strom and UREC, an HTTP client library for Rust that's been downloaded literally hundreds of millions of times. So he knows a thing or two about open source. And although he hasn't been on the show before, he's been a technical consultant since the very beginning and an occasional sound engineer too. And he also happens to be my husband. So Martin, welcome to the show.
Hello, great to be here.
It's great to have you here. Any opening remarks you want to make before we get into it?
Oh, no, that's plenty. I'm blushing already.
Okay, so this episode, I'm going to divide it into three chunks. The first chunk, we're going to look at the origins of open source software. Then the second part, we're going to look at the history of Apple's changing relationship with open source. And then part three, we're going to look at where Apple is at today with open source. And it's in a very different place today than it was back in its golden era with Steve Jobs at the helm. But I promise, first of all, the origins of open source. And we're going to go back quite a way to look at this. In fact, we're going to go all the way back to set the scene in 1886. So the year is 1886. The Statue of Liberty has just raised her torch above New York Harbor. Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet was receiving lukewarm reception from concertgoers. The US Marine Corps marched to Semper Fidelis for the first time, and Monroe Rosenfeld wanted Johnny to get his gun. Printing had been around for 400 years, and the printing press had enabled people to much more efficiently copy ideas. So it was very much recognized that each work of copy was building on what had come before, and that sharing was a part of the way in which this body of intellectual property that was being printed was built and developed. But at the same time, there was a feeling that it was only fair that people that were contributing to this body of written work should in some way be rewarded. And that's why different countries around the world were introducing different and often contradictory laws on how copyright should work. This was formalized in 1886 in Bern, Switzerland, when 10 countries, mostly European countries, but also Haiti, Liberia, and Tunisia, signed the Bern Convention, which for centuries was the gold standard of copyright. It established the international copyright system, and we still have it today. And now there are 182 signatories to the Bern Convention. So it's a pretty much universal system now, but it's interesting to consider that it's still a relatively modern convention, and there's nothing inherent about copyright. It's just a legal concept that was developed a couple of hundred years ago. Does anyone want to say anything about that? Any thoughts on the history of copyright?
Well, it started off, like you said, as a way of protecting authors, but it's gone to far beyond that. And you might say that it doesn't even protect authors anymore. I mean, really, it protects the profits of companies who somehow have managed to own the rights to the author's work. In the case of music, mostly for that.
Yeah, no, I think that the interesting thing about copyright and how it's used now to destroy creativity is that throughout history, creativity and kind of scientific endeavor, they were going hand in hand, and it was always a rehashing and copy pasting from previous work. And you see everything from like people painting the same motifs or like copying each other's techniques or whatever, to like the kind of sampling culture and the kind of stuff that grew out in the 80s and the rap music and hip hop and all this kind of stuff, to like how that just happened and it was fine. And to today, that if you even like consider that you might want to have a sample from some other person's work in your music or in a track you're making, then you're in for a legal battle or you're in for a complicated situation, because that can't just be done. And I think that kind of ultimately is only used to stifle creativity at this point. It's not actually protecting anyone but the big copyright owners, and it's destroying culture in some respects, because you can't do stuff that you always could do in the past.
Yeah. And I think that is something that we should have in mind, because as we go through the changing role of copyright in software and Apple's involvement in that, those themes we will keep coming back to. So I think it's great to set the table with those issues before we delve in. The next interesting point to make about copyright is when computer code emerged, it wasn't initially covered by copyright, and there was some ambiguity there. The idea of copyright is it protects works. And initially, computer code was not seen as a work. Books were works and music were works. The Berne Convention didn't cover computer code because that was a new thing. And so it was a legally moot area. And that only really got formalized into international law as being covered by copyright in the late 90s, as we will get into. What we did have in the early days of computers was a lot of this same collaboration and sharing. So early computer people shared their code with each other. They were more like scientists than business people. And even as big corporations like IBM got involved in developing commercial computers, they shared the source code of their early operating systems. This is because IBM saw its product as being the hardware, and the operating system was just something that they needed to create to use the hardware. There was no copyright ownership and there were no software licenses. IBM came under antitrust pressure from the US government. In 1969, they said that IBM couldn't distribute its operating system with its hardware because that was locking out third-party software vendors who could develop alternative operating systems. That is actually the origin of commercially charged software, and it was forced on IBM by the US government for antitrust reasons. Any thoughts on that?
Well, if only they did it today.
Yeah, then I could put Linux on my MacBook.
You mean you would like if the US government forced Apple to unbundle macOS from the Mac?
No, I think it's more generally like that the government would actually put pressure to do those kind of things seems incomprehensible in today's kind of commercial climate. And I would just like to see more of that kind of enforcement where you're trying to preserve that many people can compete instead of it being creating monopolies, which is ironic that I'm saying here on a podcast about Apple, but here we are.
Okay, well, even as licensed software was emerging, the sharing of software was still very common, especially at something called the Homebrew Computer Club. Anyone want to talk about the Homebrew Computer Club?
I don't know any details other than every story of like modern nerd computing tends to end up back there.
So this was a club in Silicon Valley in California. In the 1970s, the Homebrew Computer Club, fairly small but massively influential club, of which Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were members, as well as many other people who were highly influential in the emergence of what at the time became known as the home computer. And was the designer of a very popular home computer, Apple I. Jobs and Woz got together through the Homebrew Computer Club, and I guess Jobs was more the commercial brains who wanted to sell it, and Woz was the guy that wanted to build it. And the Apple I emerged from this Homebrew Computer Club. So as people in this club were building their own homemade computers, the question emerged of what software they were going to run on it. And they basically just shared software between themselves on floppy disks and cassette tapes. And there wasn't really a concept of licensing software because the concept of licensing software itself was very new. Plus, there was absolutely no money in this. It was a hobby club. And these home computers were interesting, but they weren't actually useful. When you turn one of these computers on, it could hardly do anything. So the people that were playing with this stuff, it was more the potential they could see and the challenge of seeing if they could build these things and just the love of the technology. All of this was happening at a pivotal time as software was shifting from something that was shared to something that was proprietary and licensed. And with that in mind, that very much affected how Apple was founded and the business model that Jobs and Woz had for Apple, which to a large extent exists to this day. So an ad in 1976 for the Apple I said, "Our philosophy is to provide software for our machines free or at minimal cost." And I think that is the reason why even to this day, Mac OS comes free when you buy a hardware Mac.
I think it's changing though with Apple in
Yeah.
the last.
What about Logic subscriptions?
Yeah, there's Logic.
Well, that's true.
Logic Final Cut, and they were a one-off payment, and now you can keep using those. But if you want most new features, then you have to start subscribing.
You can find those examples, and there they are. But Microsoft, which emerged at this same time as Apple, had a more modern idea. I guess Apple's old-fashioned idea was that software was like a necessary evil. You needed to have that in order to sell hardware, whereas Microsoft was a pure play software endeavor, which is why they had the word soft in their name. And that was a very new idea, because the idea of just a business that was predicated entirely on selling software was novel at the time. And it didn't endear them to that Homebrew Computer Club, because the Homebrew Computer Club loved sharing the software, and they continued to share the software. So Microsoft had developed a form of BASIC that was very popular with the Homebrew Computer Club, and they just shared it freely, and they didn't pay Bill Gates a dime. And Bill Gates was not happy about that. Any of you remember or know about his open letter to hobbyists?
I don't know about that.
Well, Charlie, would you like to be Bill Gates and read a short passage from his open letter to hobbyists? You have to channel your inner Bill Gates. Here we go.
As the majority of hobbyists must be aware, most of you steal your software. Hardware must be paid for, but software is something to share. Who cares if the people who work on it get paid? Is this fair? I mean, he's got a point.
The Homebrew Computer Club largely didn't think he had a point. Some people argued that it was the hobbyists that had helped make Altair Basic successful, and Microsoft went on to license it to big companies thanks to the popularity that the hobbyists had given it. Martin, you maybe can be Homebrew Computer Club member Jim Warren, who replied thusly to Bill Gates' open letter.
There is a viable alternative to the problems raised by Bill Gates in his irate letter to computer hobbyists concerning ripping off software. When software is free or so inexpensive that it's easier to pay for it than to duplicate it, then it won't be stolen.
So what do you think about that?
I mean, this is the basis of shareware, no? Which was how software did get paid for after.
Yep.
So shareware was you would distribute your software on floppy disks, but mostly you would get copies from friends. So the distribution would be taken care of like that. And then if you liked it, you would pay for it. And the cost was usually quite low.
One of the things that struck me in terms of the argument that a lot of the hobbyists were making is a totally viable commercial model for software, in that you don't charge licenses when it's used in a non-profit, non-commercial way by hobbyists. And you do recognize the value that they are contributing by creating a buzz around your product, and you charge for the people that are actually making money out of your product, like big corporations. And so I actually think that the Homebrew Computer Club made a valid point in retort to Bill Gates. I think what was happening here was a battle of ideas. The idea of charging for software at all was new. And so what they're thrashing out in the Homebrew Computer Club is who gets to charge, how much do they get to charge, and how do they charge? Because this was all new and it was up for grabs. And those two models, the Apple model and the Microsoft model, emerged in the Homebrew Computer Club and exist largely to this day, with the introduction of another component, which is free software or open source software, which is what we're now going to dive into. Anyone want to describe the free software movement? And I'm thinking here about how it originally merged in the early 80s, and also how we should think about free software versus open source and the similarities, the differences and overlap.
I think that the fundamental problem in commercial software, I mean, I work as a developer, so obviously I sell software, but nothing exists in isolation. So when you take something like Windows or anything that Apple produces or whatever, it's always building up on the work, the shoulder of giants before them. And a lot of software development, or like the stuff that becomes the new hot thing, starts in the university world. It's research that then later gets commercialized into software. So I think the principle of charging for software is problematic in that at what point can you take something which is shared knowledge, shared goods, and then just turn that into something that you're making a profit out of, and why are you entitled to that profit? So I think that sort of is not something that is explained exactly with how we get from the homebrew community via shareware to where we are today.
Like the end game example of that was OpenAI, which was exactly that. It was a non-profit organization, which meant that it got a lot of leeway in the amount of copyrighted materials it could, it was a research project. So it really got to just do what it wanted and scrape everything from the internet. And then it turned itself into a for-profit after it had done that, which is very convenient. So that's really, cutting out the middleman in a way.
It's an interesting analogy, yeah. In the 1980s, the Free Software Foundation emerged, 1985, and the GNU project. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, this was a very important start for the open source movement because the ideas then worked into the Free Software Foundation and the GPL have been super important in terms of setting the tone for open source and everything we have seen built on top of that. The GNU project is a project that basically takes some of these ideas around software being free, as in free speech, and creates a license for that, which is the GPL, which is the public license, the GNU public license. The GNU Foundation came up with this license, and it also have a bunch of software that has been very fundamental for everything that we do today and still are being heavily used. Linux is technically a GNU Linux, and it's still very, very important that if you take Linux and you use Linux and you sell Linux, you can't do that with also sharing the source code for what you're doing. That's come from GNU, and the Free Software Foundation is a starting point of that, but obviously it's gone much further since then.
So at this time, there was an operating system called Unix, which was a proprietary operating system owned by AT&T. And this is really what the GNU project wanted to create, a free version of Unix, something that was completely interoperable with Unix, but wasn't owned by AT&T. Of course, Unix became an important part of Apple's story with the introduction of macOS 10. So we're going to come to that a little bit. And Martin, then you talked about Linux. So Linus Torvalds developed the Linux kernel, which became a part of the GNU project. Actually, the Free Software Foundation was working on its own kernel, but they were very ambitious and had all kinds of vision for it, and it didn't work out. And GNU decided to instead go with Linux.
There are still people working on GNU Herd and other variants of other operating systems. So okay. I wouldn't say that this is like nothing. It's still there.
Okay, I stand corrected. Linux, it's in everything, right? I mean, does someone want to just touch on exactly how ubiquitous Linux is today?
Well, I mean, it's used absolutely everywhere. So every hosting center, every service we interact with, everything has Linux in the bottom. You obviously have Windows servers and companies that build on that, but they are in minority to Linux servers, I would say.
Also, it's Android phones and any small computing device, like the little computers inside things like fridges and stuff.
Before we move on from free software to open source, there's one other part that we need to unpack, which, Martin, you touched on with the GPL license, which is we need to think about copyleft. Who wants to talk about copyleft?
Copyleft means you own the copyright to some software that you've written, but you published it under a copyleft license, which means that anyone else that takes your open source project and uses it and builds something on top, they also need to publish their modifications and their things that they built in it. And you also see typically that a lot of enterprise, like big companies, they would go to much effort to avoid anything that attaches a copyleft license, because the legal problems they can get into if it's been used in their product and then that's discovered later in court or whatever, they would run the risk of having to publish a lot of their kind of proprietary code. So in enterprise, you have a strong feeling of not using any software that attaches that kind of license.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I have a quote here from Steve Ballmer, who was the CEO of Microsoft after Bill Gates and a noted opponent of open source. That, Charlie, I'm giving you all the baddies today.
Yeah, Ballmer and Gates.
You were Bill Gates before, but now you get to be Ballmer, and I'm just sending you that now.
Linux is not in the public domain. Linux is a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. That's the way the license works. The way the license is written, if you use any open source software, you have to make the rest of your software open source. I mean, I wouldn't call it a cancer, but I mean, that's an accurate quote, no?
Not really. It's wrong to characterize all open source software as being copyleft. Copyleft is a certain sub part of open source software that has these kind of deliberate restrictions and attached licenses to them.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to get onto. So Steve Ballmer said that in 2001. And by that time, there wasn't just free software, there was open source software. He is talking specifically about Linux there, which is free software under a GPL license. But I think he's clearly tarring all open source with the same brush. So what happened was the free software emerged in the 1980s, but into the 90s, there was a perception by the Steve Ballmers of this world that free software was almost anti-American, that far from being freedom, it was the opposite of freedom, because it's a question of who gets to be free to do what. And so this was a reaction against free software. And this is actually part of where the open source movement came about. So open source emerged in the 1990s as a way to take the edge off the cancerous aspect, as Steve Ballmer saw it, of giving the freedom to use free software, but not have to share the result. And these are often described as more permissive licenses because they permit you to use open source software and choose which parts of your code you share and which parts you keep proprietary. And this was a very important model because what it meant was that companies, including Apple, could start to use open source software and commercialize products built on top of it. So that was a key development that emerged in the 90s. And aligned with that, in 1996, the International Copyright System was formally extended to cover computer programs as literary works by the WIPO Copyright Treaty. How would you say that?
No,
do you say WIPO, WIPO, or
who knows?
I'm gonna say WIPO. So that rounds up part one, the history of intellectual property in general, computer code and open source in particular, and Apple and Microsoft's pivotal role in the 1970s in engaging in that discussion that led to the concept of commercial software that we have today. So that's part one. Part two is Apple and open source, specifically Apple's open source products. And what I would say in the outset is the Apple of today is very different to the Apple under Steve Jobs on his return in 1997. So a lot of the company's early success was built on engaging with open source projects and building on top of open source projects to create many of the incredible Apple products that we know today, like Mac OS X and WebKit, which is Safari, and many other open source projects besides. So under Steve Jobs, Apple embraced open source and pioneered open source. But open source is about being open, and Apple culture isn't always about being open. In fact, Apple culture is often quite the opposite. It's about being secretive. So I wanted to discuss the uneasy relationship between Apple culture and open source culture. And yeah, what does everyone think of that?
Well, I think from just before Steve Jobs' return, when Apple was still licensing clones, people were making Apple clones. And I think when Apple built Mac OS X, if it was made open source, then anyone could have built a clone. Anybody could have taken the Mac operating system and put it on any computer. And I'm pretty sure that as a company which is about the hardware, it's about the software, but really it's a hardware company, and the software is what makes its hardware good. That's definitely not something they would have wanted to do. Make it give away the software so other people could make copies of their computers.
Yeah. Apple famously doesn't talk about future products. They only talk about products once they're announced. And therefore, before a product is announced, it is top secret. And it's famous how secretive Apple is as a company. And that secrecy was something that Steve Jobs introduced on his return in 1997 I think because he was such a master of public relations that he knew he was going to get the biggest media coverage of a product announcement if it came as a complete surprise. So he wanted, when he went up on stage and revealed what the new thing was, for no one to have heard anything about it. And in order to achieve that, which he largely did, he had to lock everything down, that none of his engineers were allowed to talk about what they were doing. And I think going back to our discussion about the origins of intellectual property, this collaborative move forwards in terms of figuring stuff out, this culture of secrecy that Steve Jobs introduced at Apple wasn't a natural bedfellow with that, because if Apple engineers had to be so secretive about what they were doing, it made it very difficult for them to really engage with the open source community. And Martin, do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's quite striking because it comes down on a personal level. If you're in an open source context, then you encounter other people. Like if you're collaborating around a project that you're interested in as a developer, and you are encountering other people around that project, these days you encounter people from other big companies. You can see like people coming from Microsoft or Red Hat or whatever, and you would sort of help out. I think Apple engineers in those contexts, they do exist, but they're less common. And I think my impression is that maybe there is less kind of personal initiative that Apple employees can take to be part of things like that. It's like, I know that some contracts, at least that I've encountered in my professional career, then you can have these kind of sweeping statements that you are not allowed to work on private personal projects outside of work hours unless they are approved by the company and all this kind of stuff. I don't know that Apple have those kind of contracts in place. I can just speculate that there might be mechanisms like that in place to somewhat curtail how much engagement there is in open source projects by Apple. This is all speculation. It's just my personal experience of what kind of people I encounter. And it's definitely, it does happen. It's not like this is like you never see anyone from Apple anywhere. That's not what I'm saying. It's just in terms of level of engagement, and also in the projects that I have personally been running, then when people come from different things, we might have private chats these days in Discord or whatever, and they can tell me a little bit about what they're working on and how that slots into the bigger business. They might not be able to tell me everything, but at least something. And that's something that I have not encountered with the app person yet. But that's personal experience. It could be that other people have other experiences.
Well, one thing that we will get into, and I thought you could talk about here, Martin, was code dumps. What is a code dump, and why did Apple do code dumps?
I think what you're talking about is the thing where Apple would now and then do a code dump of, say, WebKit or something like that.
Yeah.
And this is because the origins of WebKit is KHTML, which is a library that was written on KDE, Linux windowing system. And KHTML came with a license that meant Apple couldn't just take this code and keep it for themselves. So to fulfill the license obligation they have of you taking that code and developing it further into WebKit, they have to publish that back. And I think this is what we mean with the code dump, is that every now and then Apple is working internally on a bunch of stuff, and then they're like, okay, right, now we fulfill the license, let's dump out what we have. And in most open source projects, you would see the gradual commit by commit incremental changes to the code base as they happen. But in a code dump kind of scenario, then instead you would just get a big blotch of stuff. Here it is, boom. And then you don't hear anything for a while again.
When Steve Jobs went on stage to announce Safari and he revealed that it was based on KHTML, that got a lot of surprises and gasps in the audience. We've actually done a separate episode on that, which you should definitely check out. Some of the people most surprised were the people working on the KHTML project, because they knew nothing about it. And this is where the first code dump came, because Steve Jobs said, we've been working on this for a year. We've actually added lots of stuff and made it much better. We're going to give all that back to you. You're welcome. And the people from KHTML were like watching that along with everyone else. And it was news to them. And it's like, oh, we're going to get all of this code. But of course, getting it with no consultation and here you go, here it all is. It's then a massive task to then review this huge job that's been dumped in your lap of here's everything that Apple's done with your project. Apple didn't endear itself to the open source community by working in this way. So I think you can see two different strands here in that Steve Jobs was absolutely right that these big surprises in keynote announcements were great for PR. But then I think the engineers are also absolutely right that it's not great to work in secret and then lob a load of code over the fence and let people deal with it. I was listening to an interesting episode of the podcast Acquired where they interviewed Brendan Eich, the chief architect of Netscape, and he provided a little bit of color on this, which I'm going to give you, Charlie, a quote to read.
By 2005, Dave Hyatt and others at Apple had said, let's stop patch bombing KHTML. Let's make our own little mini Mozilla. It'll be run by Apple, but it will be WebKit.org. It will be a proper open source project. And good for them. They did it. And that became the basis for not only what they put in Safari, but for Chrome. So there was a gleam in Larry Page's eyes when, last I saw him in 2005, he was saying, yeah, WebKit's so clean. It's a clean man. There, I added that last bit.
The shift then we see from patch bombing or code dumps or whatever you want to call it, that approach to more of a positive engagement in the community where Dave Hyatt was regularly making blog posts to explain what the team were doing with Safari and what new things they were going to support and what changes they were going to make. That was a philosophical change. It was a cultural shift for Apple. And I think it was a recognition on the part of Apple under Steve Jobs that they needed to find some middle ground where they remained secretive so they could have their big product announcements, but they also needed to give some engineers the latitude like they gave Dave Hyatt to engage the community in positive ways too. And I think it was a bit of a tightrope that he had to walk because on the one hand, he was communicating a roadmap really of where Safari was going to go next in implementing web standards. But at the same time, new versions of Safari remained like big announcement that Steve Jobs wanted to announce as a surprise. So I think he probably had to do a lot of mental gymnastics to remember what he was allowed to say and what he wasn't allowed to say. So anything else to say on WebKit?
Well, I don't know if we mentioned it enough, but obviously WebKit was itself then forked by Google Chrome to what they call Blink. They took part of the rendering bits and the HTML, CSS interpretation and from Blink, and that is what powers Chrome. So in some respects, that little open source project that started with KHTML and Conqueror and on Linux then swept the world and took over everything. So it all has its roots in the same code base. Clean code base.
Yeah, so clean.
And it's interesting there that actually Apple's role in contributing to KHTML with WebKit, which then Google built on with their own rendering engine, Apple became like a stepping stone in a process that ultimately led to Chrome. And I don't think that was Steve Jobs' intention at all. In fact, Apple had shipped Safari for Windows explicitly because they really wanted to be Chrome. But I think Larry Page, with that sparkle in his eye, drunk Steve Jobs' milkshake there. And that's maybe one of the challenges when you're trying to be commercial and engage with open source, in that if you don't take things in the direction that the open source community engages with, then they might go off in another direction instead, and you might lose control of the project. Okay, well, I think one of the most influential open source projects for Apple was one which maybe a lot of people haven't heard of, which is Darwin. Does anyone want to talk about what Darwin is?
Okay, so Darwin is Apple's operating system, effectively. If we think about the stack of what we have the microkernel at the bottom, the XNU, and then on top of that we have Darwin, and this is a BSD offshoot. If we go back again to the 80s, we had some larger groupings of operating systems that belonged together. You had AT&T's model and you had the BSD model. Darwin is a BSD offshoot, so in some respects it comes from a different lineage than Linux. They have big overlaps these days in terms of tooling and things that you can use on one, you can use on the other. But technically, there is something here which is different, which is this layer of the operating system.
A bit to add there. So BSD was developed at the University of California, Berkeley, and it was based on Unix. But Berkeley rewrote a lot of it so that it no longer relied on AT&T's code. But there was a court case. This is an early kind of open source versus licensed software court case. The court case established that whilst BSD was interoperable with Unix, it no longer contained any contested or copyright code. So BSD was a kind of rewrite of a Unix-compatible operating system that didn't have any Unix code in it. macOS 10, on which modern macOS and in fact all Apple's operating systems are based, is based in turn on NextStep, which was the operating system that Steve Jobs developed in his wilderness years between his first and second spell at Apple. So Apple acquired Next, Steve Jobs' company, in 1997 and made the new version of macOS based on NextStep. And we've done a couple of episodes on that if you want to get more on it. What is interesting for our purposes here is when Steve Jobs was at Next, he decided to base his new operating system on Unix because his original vision for Next was that it was going to be a computer for the education sector. And particularly, he was thinking higher education and universities, and they all used Unix. And in fact, one of the things he promised the board at Apple when he went off to found Next was that he wouldn't be competing with Apple because he'd be targeting higher education, which wasn't an area that Apple was big in. And it was clear that higher education customers wanted Unix systems. So his vision was to create a Unix system with a really nice desktop operating system on top of it, a best of both worlds system. That's what NextStep was. It never really took off because the hardware wasn't exactly what universities wanted and was expensive. And there were a lot of mistakes that he made. But this concept of having a Unix-compatible operating system with a really nice desktop user interface on top of it was something that there definitely was a demand for. And so I think when Apple bought Next to make NextStep the new version of macOS, they had that baked in. The way in which he did this, by using BSD, which was distributed under the BSD license, which is one of the more permissive licenses, it wasn't copyleft. What it meant was that Apple could take the BSD Unix with their own kernel, which was developed by Arvi Tavanian, who was the CTO of Next and later the CTO of Apple. They had an open source Unix bit, and then they built a glossy macOS user interface that was proprietary on top of it. And so I think that's what's interesting for our discussion today was that they, in macOS 10, and in fact in every Apple product now, they had an underlying open source component with a glossy proprietary component built on top of that. And this, I guess, has been their business model ever since. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of fun that we talk about Cocoa is like a framework that came with NextStep. And it's like the stuff that we use to draw windows and do stuff on macOS, and we have another one on iOS. All the code calls that you do when you're working with these lower level libraries on macOS, they typically you write NS and something, and that goes back to that it's still NextStep. So today, if you write low-level code on macOS, you're still working with NextStep. You're not getting away from it.
And it's not even just on the Mac, even on new platforms like watchOS and Vision Pro as well, you'll still see NS in there, which is interesting. One of the things that I was thinking about here, how common is that as a business model in terms of this hybrid of open source underneath and proprietary on top, that the user space or the user experience is the proprietary bit? Is that a common model these days, or is that really just Apple doing that?
I would say that if we take Android phones, for instance, then we have Linux in the bottom, and Android itself is Google's thing, of course. But you have adaptations by pretty much all the big vendors. If you get a Samsung Android phone, it comes with a bunch of proprietary Samsung software on top where they try to, I guess, make stuff that is really good for their hardware. That's another area where I can think of that's how it works. I mean, if we think in a wider sense, web servers and all the kind of stuff that I do for work, we have Linux in the bottom, and then we write proprietary web services and things on top of that we sell. And that again means that we have proprietary software running on top of open source software at the bottom. So yeah, I would say that this is very common of how you structure your stack. I think commercial operating systems where you don't have, that's pretty much just Windows that you would see that to a large extent now.
Where the whole thing is proprietary.
The whole thing is proprietary from top to bottom.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things here is going back to Next Step, one of the resistances that Next encountered in trying to sell their computers to higher education was that their customers didn't like that the operating system was proprietary. So in fact, they open sourced Next Step and renamed it OpenStep. And that didn't really help. And so when they developed macOS, they moved back to their former model, which was open source underpinnings, and the new kind of glossy Aqua Mac layer on top was proprietary. The last thing I wanted to talk about Darwin before we move on is there was a darwin.org website, and there was hope by some at Apple that Darwin would develop as an ongoing open source project with community engagement, that other people, not just Apple, would contribute to Darwin. But that didn't really happen, did it? Why was that?
I mean, I can only speculate. I think that we already had Linux for those purposes. When you come down to the differences between running a server on, say, BSD, because there still is like FreeBSD and NetBSD and all those variants that you can run, which is then alternatives to Linux if you now want to have Unix style system on a server. The differences in terms of what it is, it's almost like you need to be a purist to really care about the nuances and the differences. There are differences, of course, but for most people, that difference is so minute that you don't really care much. And there will be people who disagree with that a lot because they obviously really love BSD or whatever. And I think Darwin is one of those, it's like, well, you could choose Darwin, but why would you? You had something else going already. And also remember, on this level, we are talking about hardware compatibility. And this is something that Apple doesn't deal with because they do their own hardware. So they only need to have 10, 20 device drivers. They obviously have more than that. But say in terms of revisions they have of their hardware, they don't need to support that many different variants. But if you take something like Linux, it has hardware drivers for a big range of different kinds of hardware, historical hardware, modern hardware, all sorts of things. So I think Darwin, to make it actually function in an equivalent way to, say, Linux, you need all this device driver support as well, which is not there unless you make them.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess also the timing is an interesting thing to consider with Darwin, that in the late 90s, when Apple was making the shift to macOS 10 and trying to float Darwin as an open source project, Linux was gathering steam, but it hadn't become the de facto standard open source operating system that it is, but it was becoming it. So you can see why Apple thought there might be a chance for Darwin, but you can also see with the benefit of hindsight why there wasn't. I guess today, the reason that you would always choose GNU Linux is just because it is the most widely adopted one. It's the one that's contributed to the most. As you say, it's got the most compatibility. And so it would almost be perverse to choose anything else. But in the environment back in the late 90s, it hadn't quite achieved the dominance that it now has. It was certainly on the way to it, but it hadn't achieved it. And so I guess Apple thought maybe there was room for another one.
I wonder what Apple's idea was. What would be the advantage for Apple if Darwin had taken off and been more successful as an open source project? I mean, they would have got stuff folded back in, I guess, but it's not like they necessarily need that in the way they work.
I think there might have been another thought that they had, which they succeeded with, which is going back to the late 1990s, trust in Apple was at zero. Why would anyone use their operating system when the company was on the edge of going bankrupt? If you commit to Apple's products, how do you know that they're still going to be around a year from now? And how do you know that their product is any good? And I think maybe one of the factors, certainly with the higher education customers they were targeting, was if you can actually see all the underpinnings of macOS, that provides some reassurance. There's the many eyes concept of security as well, because like macOS was open source, then everything was open to scrutiny. So I think one of the early successes that macOS 10 had was that it was adopted by a lot of developers, including Martin. It was very popular with them. Unix compatibility was a part of that story. And I suspect that the fact that everything in its underpinnings was open source, so you could take a look under the hood if you wanted, was another reassurance factor that made people buy in.
Idealistically and philosophically, that's a good thing. But in practice, maybe then it was different. Maybe then education tasked with buying computers and software for education cared about that kind of thing, because they definitely do not care about that now. It's Chrome, it's the cheapest thing. They care about the administration of it more than anything, and deployment and things like this, rather than the underlying security and the open source nature of something.
There are many other open source projects that Apple has developed or contributed to that we could look at, but I wanted to round up with one that I think is something that a lot of people might not have heard of, but is arguably Apple's biggest and most influential contribution to an open source project, which is LLVM, which we touched on at the start and is not Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy. It's something else. It's a compiler. So Martin, could you tell us, A, what is a compiler, and B, what is LLVM, and what did Apple contribute to it?
Well, I mean, whether it's Apple's most important, I don't know. It's right now very influential, but arguably WebKit may be more widely used than LLVM. So LLVM, when you write some software, we write some source code, we have different programming languages, so C++ and C, and these days we have things like Swift, and Objective-C was like the earlier one that Next Step was written in. And we have Rust today is like a big thing that I love. These programming languages, they have different syntax, different ideas about how you express your code. And ultimately, they all need to go from this level where we express the code, the things that we want to write, and we take it all the way down to binary. In the past, you would have a compiler that would make that entire journey from the text source code all the way to binary, and you have one thing that did the whole compilation. To write a new compiler that takes source code to binary and creates a binary that actually is really performant and works well, even if you just target a small subsections of hardware available, is a huge undertaking. And LLVM does this little clever trick where it sits at the last bit, but effectively creates the binary, but it has a kind of common interface that you use on the other side that goes from the source code. So there is an intermediate representation. You can think of it as a common programming language, but lower than, say, Swift or C or whatever. Or you can think of it as assembly, pretty much. That is the input to LLVM. And then LLVM will do the final bit of just pushing this all the way down to the actual architecture. So above that, we have things like Swift or Objective-C. We have something called Clang, which is the compiler that runs C, C++, and Objective-C. Rust. There's like a whole bunch of different languages that compiles, and they can stop at this intermediate representation. They don't have to target every single piece of hardware architecture, because as soon as you fulfill the kind of contract of what's needed for LLVM, then LLVM takes it the rest of the way down to the final binary and applies all of those optimizations and these things that are so important to really get max performance out of software today. This was created and is pretty huge because I think you wouldn't necessarily even try to write your own compiler from top to bottom in a serious way, like it really performs. Maybe if you have your own hardware and you're targeting something very, very specific, then maybe you would consider doing it. But the question always also comes like, which language are we starting with? And then we default to C or C++ or something like that. So LLVM has really been like super important for modern programming languages in a way that has been it's a big shift for developers of late. Like Rust keeps coming up as a kind of most loved language in various services and so on year after year. And yeah, we are implicitly using this open source project. Both Rust itself is obviously open source and LLVM is open source. And Apple has a part in that history. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. So in that history, Apple hired Chris Latner, who had been working on this project, which became LLVM. And from a high level perspective, if you're a developer on Apple platforms, then, you develop your project in Xcode. And when you compile that project to run on a device, then it uses a compiler, and you don't need to deal with that. You don't need to touch that. It's sort of something that Xcode does for you. And GCC, the GNU compiler, that's what Apple used in Xcode as well for years. But when they hired Chris Lattner, they had this very controversial idea at the time, which was to switch from using GCC, which is what the whole industry used at the time, really, to LLVM, which they did. And from a developer's perspective, I guess you might not notice much difference because you're just hitting the compile button on Xcode as before. But under the hood, there was this other magic happening, which resulted in faster compile times, better diagnostics, and better code completion. And so it's gone from a situation where GCC was what pretty much everyone used to compile software to LLVM, the open source compiler that Apple very much pioneered, has now been adopted by a huge swathe of the software industry, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Rust, I think, is one of the biggest users of it if you take apart from Apple's own Clang and those things. But there certainly are a whole bunch of other languages there as well, which interfaces with LLVM. Do you have this shift, at least the way I see it, is that we're moving away from insecure languages like C++ and C and embrace things like Rust and maybe Swift, because a lot of the bugs and security problems and things that arise in software comes from these unsafe practices. Now, LLVM in itself does not help or make that any better, largely at least. But I think that software like Rust, I don't think you would have taken that project as far as it's now got without LLVM in the bottom, because it runs on Windows. You can target Linux, you can target macOS, you can target iPhone devices, you can target everything. LLVM sorts out the final bit there, which basically takes it to the final architecture that you want to run it on. So it's a very important movement.
Then just bringing us up to date, Chris Lattner, after his work on LLVM, or alongside that, he was working on a Skunkworks project, which wasn't really signed off by the senior management at Apple, as I understand, which was a certain programming language called Swift. I guess this was something he had in mind for LLVM, and he then put that forward to the powers that be at Apple. And eventually there was some recognition that there was a need for Apple to move on from Objective-C, which was the language that all its platforms were developed in, to a more modern language. The Swift language is also open source, swift.org. So Apple had hoped, I guess, by making Swift open source, that it would be adopted beyond just developing for Apple platforms. But I think by and large, it hasn't been. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's maybe a little bit like a Darwin. It's open source, but there isn't really from my perspective, a reason for me to embrace it. There can be some good aspects of having the same language on both, say, your client, your iPhone, and your server. So maybe there could be situations where you would want to have Swift all the way, maybe sharing some code or whatever. But there isn't like a really good reason for me to use Swift in any other context than the ones that I have to use it. Well, have to, but where I want to use it, which is if I develop for Apple stuff. So I think that's the reason. It's another Darwin. It's like, yeah, it's open source. It is there. You could use it. It's functional. It can do all the things that you need it to do. But also, why would you use it? It's nice. A lot of the ideas that came, Chris Lattner and Swift, have been adopted by other languages. There's a lot of cross-pollination between these different, more modern programming languages. But yeah, I have similar nice things in other languages as well.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I mean, that really brings us up to date. Charlie, I was wondering, as we're sort of wrapping up now, and listening to all of this, what is your takeout from this? And also, where do you think Apple is with open source today? Is it love or hate open source? Is it good or bad at open source? And what do you think the future has in store?
I think Apple might be like many other big companies which have aspects of open source software deep down inside their software stack. And companies like to take things which are free, but tend not to contribute back to it, either financially or in terms of code. Financially is important because a lot of this stuff is one person working in a back room. We should link to an XKCD cartoon about this. which is pretty much how the entirety of like modern technology is built. One guy coding a project which supports everything else. So as we saw earlier, Apple's almost malicious compliance with the open source licenses, with code dumps, with its problems in the EU being told that it has to open up the App Store and things like this by the European Commission. And malicious compliance is what Apple's about with these things. So yeah, I see parallels there. I think that open source is also coming into its own in a new way, with the rest of the world realizing that they're relying on American software from Microsoft, Google, and all kinds of other bits and pieces. That's not a very good idea going forward, as now we can no longer trust these companies not to be under the influence of the...
There was a case of the International Criminal Court, one of the judges getting their access to Outlook disabled by Microsoft under order from the US government is what triggered concern from a lot of European governments that their reliance on American technology could put them vulnerable to political interference, which is interesting because that brings us full circle to the idea of free speech, actually, that quite literally is free speech. If you don't have free software, you can't send an email.
Yeah, exactly. So we're seeing European governments now. France is looking at open source alternatives for a lot of software, American software it uses. There's the Schleswig-Holstein region in Germany. It's already gone away from using Microsoft's Office bits and pieces.
One issue with talking about, say, a company's relationship to open source is that, from my perspective, open source is personal endeavors. It's people that drive open source projects by a large majority. Like, I don't think there is a coincidence that when we talk about big sort of software shifts, we're talking about Chris Lattner or Dave Hyatt or whatever. It's driven by passionate people who want to create things and share things. And open source comes from this, at least for myself, from a drive that I love just making things, and I get even more excited if I make things and it's useful to someone else and they like what I do and use it in there. So me engaging with this is like it's like something that I just love doing. And a company doesn't have that kind of, they might open source things for, I don't know, commercial reasons or some reason or obligation or something like that. I don't know exactly what the purpose is. I mean, goodwill maybe is another one. There are very few companies out there which are based, where the company itself is based on an open source idea. They are around, there are a few, but certainly not any of these big ones like Apple and so on. And I think that's why open source will continue also, is like, it's because people do it. And right now we're going through a huge shift with the whole AI stuff, which is affecting all developers, whether we like it or not. And in some respects, it's becoming more about personal creativity. I mean, companies are also creating things, but if we look at software versus AI and open source, I can now create more projects. I mean, whether it's good or bad, I don't know. I can create more stuff, and this also then starts to transcend a little bit the idea of languages. Swift, Rust, the rest of them maybe becomes less important in this new world, where if we think that this whole drive comes from person, it's my drive to create that make me want to engage with this. My drive to create maybe also then doesn't have to be hampered by what programming languages I know to the same extent with these new technologies. I think there's a lot of stuff there.
Very interesting. And maybe that's a great point to close, an inspiring point to close. Okay, well, Martin and Charlie, thanks for joining us. Martin, if people want to connect with you or see your amazing open source projects on GitHub, for example, how do they do that?
Well, they go to GitHub. My email is there. My projects are there. Just go to GitHub/Algesten, ALGESTEN. I'm sure you put the link in the show notes as well.
We will indeed. And Charlie, what about if people want to connect with you?
You can find me at straightnofilter.com. Which is my website of bits and pieces, and then also on Mastodon at Mr. Charlie at indieweb.social.
Fantastic. And we will include links to those as well. And I am on Blue Sky. You'll find me at Graham Bauer at bsky.social. And also, if you want to check out my app, it's a strength training app called Reps and Sets for iPhone, Apple Watch, and iPad. And I'll include a link to that in the show notes too. And that's all we've got for you this time. So until next time, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.